All right, good morning, everyone. Hopefully you're having a start to a good Sunday. I thought I would go ahead and go through the next group of translators, which were assigned the four Gospels, the Acts of the Apostles, and the Book of Revelation. Okay, and then if I have time, then I will be getting into video 3 on truth and lies of the Jehovah's Witness cult. But I did want to just continue along because we're at least halfway through really taking a look at the translators of the KJV. And so this is a book written entitled Translators Revived by Alexander McClure. Okay, so the fourth company of these famous scholars was composed of Oxford divines, and to them, as their portion of the work, were assigned the four Gospels, the Acts of the Apostles, and the Revelation of St. John the Divine. And of course, I always leave the link so that you can come review this same material that I'm reading through for yourselves. Okay, Thomas Ravis. This person, the president of his company, was born of worthy parentage at Malden in the county of Surrey. He was bred at Westminster School and then entered in 1575 as student of Christ Church, one of the Oxford colleges, as it is a matter of some interest, showing that he went through an extensive course of study. The dates of his various degrees will be given. In 1578, he graduated as Bachelor of Arts. In 1581, he proceeded as Master of Arts. In 1589, he became Bachelor in Divinity, and in 1595, he was made Doctor in Divinity. The successive degrees of the greater part of the persons belonging to the list of translators could be given, but are omitted for the sake of brevity. It is enough to record that they nearly all attained to the highest literary honors of their respective universities. Dr. Ravis in 1591 was appointed rector of the Church of All Hallows, Barking in London. The next year he became canon of Westminster and occupied the 7th stall in that church. 2 years later he was chosen dean of Christ Church College. He was also in 1596 and the year following elected vice chancellor of the university. In 1598 he exchanged his benefice at All Hallows Church for the rectory of Islip. He also held the Rittenham Abbey Church in Berkshire. All these preferments and profitable livings mark him as a rising man. His holding a plurality of churches for the sake of their revenues, and neither of which he could perform the duties of the pastoral office, was one of the main cases that justified the complaint of the Lord Chancellor Ellesmere at the conference in Hampton Court. His lordship complained of this practice as occasioning many learned men at the universities to pine for want of places, while others had more than they could fill. I wish, therefore, he said, that some may have single coats or one living before others have doublets or pluralities. To this the frugal Bancroft, then Bishop of London, who kept his own ribs thoroughly warmed with such investitures, made the thrifty reply, but a doublet is necessary in cold weather. This prelate, a fierce persecutor of Puritans, was repudiated to have manifested very little saving grace, except in the way of penurious hoardings. The graceless wags of his day made this epitaph upon him. Here lies his grace in cold clay clad, who died for want of what he had. The pernicious custom of pluralities, whereby a man receives tithes for the care of souls, of which he takes no care, fleecing the flock he neither watches nor feeds, is one of those abuses still continued in the Church of England, and calling for thorough reform. In 1604, soon after Dr. Ravis was commissioned as one of the Bible translators, the Lords of the Council requested his acceptance of the bishopric of Gloucester for which there were very many eager suitors. 3 years later, he was translated to the bishopric of London. Anthony Wood says that he was first preferred to the see of Gloucester, which he reluctantly accepted on account of his great learning, gravity, and prudence, and that though his diocese was pretty well stocked with those who could not bear the name of a bishop, yet by his episcopal living among them, he obtained their love and a good report from them. If he deserved this commendation while at Gloucester, he changed for the worse on his translation to London, where he not only succeeded the bitter Bancroft in his office, but also in his severe and exacting behavior. So true is the remark that bishops and books are seldom the better for being translated. No sooner had he taken his seat in London than he stretched forth his hand to vex the non-conforming Puritans. Among others, he cited before him that Holly and blessed man Richard Rogers, for nearly 50 years, the faithful minister of Wethersfield, than whom, it is said, the Lord honored none more in the conversion of souls. In the presence of this venerable man, who for his close walk with God was styled the Enoch of his day, Bishop Ravis protested, "By the help of Jesus, I will not leave on preacher in my diocese who doth not subscribe and conform." The poor prelate was doomed to be disappointed, as he died before his task was well begun, on the 14th of December, 1609. On account of his high offices and his dying before the translation was completed, it is not probably that he took so active a part in that business as some of his colleagues. Though too much carried away by a zeal for the forms of his church, which was neither according to knowledge nor charity, he lived and died in deserved respect, and hath a fair monument still standing in his cathedral of St. Paul's. Okay, next, George Abbott. This distinguished ecclesiastic was a native of Guildford in Surrey. He was the son of pious parents who had been sufferers for the truth in the time of popish cruelty. He was born October 29, 1562. At the age of 14, he was entered as a student of Balliol College, Oxford, and in 1583, he was chosen to a fellowship. In 1585, he took orders and became a popular preacher in the university. He was created Doctor of Divinity in 1597, and a few months after was elected Master of University College. At this time began his conflicts with William Laud, which lasted with great severity as long as Abbott lived. Dr. Abbott was a Calvinist and a moderate churchman, while Dr. Laud was an Arminian and might have been a cardinal at Rome if he had not preferred to be a pope at Canterbury. In 1598, Dr. Abbott published a Latin work which was reprinted in Germany. The next year, he was installed Dean of Winchester. In 1600, he was elected Vice Chancellor of the university and was re-elected to the same honorable post in 1603 and 1605. It was about this time that he was put into the Royal Commission for translating the Bible. Dr. Abbott went to Scotland in 1608 as chaplain to the Earl of Dunbar, and while there, by his prudent and temperate measures, succeeded in establishing a moderate or qualified episcopacy in that kingdom. This was a matter which King James had so much at heart that he ever had held Dr. Abbott in great favor and rapidly hurried him into the highest ecclesiastical dignities and preferments. He was made Bishop of Lichfield and Coventry on the 3rd of December, 1609, and then, in less than 2 months, was translated to the See of London. In less than 15 months more, he was made Archbishop of Canterbury and Primate of all England. Thus he was twice translated himself before he saw the Bible translated once. Though an excellent preacher, he had never exercised himself in the pastoral office rising at one stride from being a university lecturer to the chief dignities of the church. When he reached the primacy, he was 49 years of age and was held in the highest esteem both by the prince and the people. In all great transactions, whether in church or state, he bore a principal part, and yet at times he showed in matters which touched the conscience a degree of independence of the royal will, such as must have been very distasteful to the domineering temper of James, and very unusual in that age of passive obedience and servile cringing to the dictates of royalty. Thus it was, when the king, under the pretense that the strict observance of the Sabbath as practiced by Protestants was likely to prejudice the Romanists and hinder their conversion, issued his infamous Book of Sports. This was a declaration intended to encourage, at the close of public worship, various recreations such as promiscuous dancing, archery, leaping, vaulting, May games, Whitsunals or Morris dances, setting up of maypoles or other sports therewith used. This abomination edict was required to be read by all ministers in their parish churches. Its promulgation greatly troubled the more conscientious of the clergy, who expected to be brought into difficulty by their refusal to publish the shameful document. Archbishop Abbott warmly opposed its enforcement and forbade it to be read in the church of Croydon, where he was at the time of its publication. The opposition was too much even for the ruthless king, and he at last gave up his impious attempt to heathenize the Lord's Day. It was 1619 that the Archbishop founded his celebrated hospital at Guildford, the place of his nativity, and nobly endowed it from his private property. In that same year, a sad mischance befell him. His health being much impaired, he had recourse to hunting, by medical advice, as a means of restoring it. This sort of exercise has never been in very good repute among ecclesiastics. Jerome recognizes some worthy fishermen who followed the sacred calling, but says that we nowhere read in Scripture of a holy hunter. While his Grace of Canterbury was pursuing the case in Barmshall Park, a seat of the Earl of Abbey de la Zouch, an arrow from his crossbow aimed at a deer glanced from a tree and killed a gamekeeper, an imprudent man, and had been cautioned to keep out of the way. This casual homicide was the cause of great affliction to the prelate. During the rest of his life, he observed a monthly fast on a Tuesday, the day of the mishap. He also settled a liberal annuity upon the poor gamekeeper's widow, which annuity was attended with the additional consolation that it soon procured her a better husband than the man she had lost. For the primate, however, who was ever a celibate, there was no such remedy of grief, and all the rest of his life was overcast with gloom. This business subjected him to many hard shots from them that liked him not. Once returning to Croydon after a long absence, a great many women from curiosity gathered about his coach. The Archbishop, who hated to be stared at and was never fond of females, exclaimed somewhat churlishly, "What make these women here?" Upon this, an old crone cried out, "You had best to shoot an arrow at us." It is said that this tongue shot, which often goes deeper than gunshots, was to his very heart. His enemies made a strong handle of this accidental homicide. It was insisted that the canon laws allows no man of blood to be builder of a spiritual temple, and that the primate, who had retreated after the accident to his hospital at Guildford, was disenabled from his clerical functions. The king appointed a commission to try the question, whether the archbishop was disqualified for his official duties by this involuntary homicide. After long debate in which the divines on the content took part, it was the general decision that the fact did disqualify. Nevertheless, King James, in his usurped character as supreme head of the English Church, an office which regularly belongs to only the King of Kings, issued in 1621 a full pardon and dispensation to the humbled primate. Still, several newly appointed bishops who had been awaiting consecration, and among them Dr. William Laud, then bishop-elect of St. David's, refused to receive it from his hands and obtain the mysterious virtues of episcopal grace from other administration. Others, however, as Dr. Davenant, bishop-elect of Salisbury, and Dr. Hall, bishop-elect of Norwich, were solemnly consecrated by their dejected metropolitan. All this did not discourage Archbishop Abbot from making vigorous opposition in the following year to the proposed match between Charles, Prince of Wales, and the Infanta, or Princess Royal of Spain. Though this foolish, unpopular, and unsuccessful scheme was a favorite piece of policy with the king, who was quite unused to be thwarted by his couriers, Dr. Abbot continued to enjoy his confidence till the king's death in 1625. When Charles I succeeded to the throne, he was crowned and anointed by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Nevertheless, the latter soon found himself in deep eclipse. His inveterate foe, the resolute Dr. Laud, then Bishop of Bath and Wells, came between and intercepted the sunshine of royal favor. The matter of the fortuitous homicide seems to have been revived against him as ground for his subscription. Charles required him to live in retirement, which he did at Ford, and in 1627 appointed a commission of 5 prelates to suspend him from the exercise of his archiepiscopal functions. These prelates were Dr. I can't pronounce that. He was Bishop of London, Dr. Neale, Bishop of Durham, Dr. Housen, Bishop of Oxford, and Dr. Laud, Bishop of Bath and Wells. When the instrument of the Archbishop's suspension was drawn up for their signature, the 4 senior bishops declined to set their hands thereto and appeared to manifest much reluctance and regret. "Then give me the pen," said Bishop Laud, and though last in place, first subscribed his name. The others, after some demur, were induced to follow his example. From that time, it is said, the Archbishop was never known to laugh and became quite dead to the world. Next year, however, the flickering king saw fit to alter his course, and about Christmas time restored Dr. Abbot to his liberty and jurisdiction. He was sent for to court, received as he stepped out of his barrage by the Archbishop of York and Earl of Dorset, and by them conducted into the royal presence. The king gave him his hand to kiss, and charged him not to fail of attendance at the council table twice a week. He sat in the House of Peers, and continued in his spiritual functions without further interruptions till his death some 5 years after, when he was succeeded in his see by his implacable and ill-starred rival, William Laud. Dr. Abbott's brief sequestration had made him popular in the country, and his restoration was probably owing to a desire to consolidate his influence in the Parliament, with which the king was already in trouble. The Archbishop rather countenanced the Liberal party and stiffly resisted the slavish tenet of Dr. Mainwaring, which raised such an excitement. This divine had publicly maintained, as was supposed, with the royal approbation, that the king's royal will and command in imposing laws, taxes, and other aids upon his people without common consent in Parliament did so far bind the consciences of the subjects of this kingdom that they could not refuse the same without peril of eternal damnation. Here was the divine right of kings with a vengeance. Dr. George Abbott continued in office during those troublous times which preceded the civil wars till he died at his palace of Croydon on Sunday, August 4th, 1633, at the age of 71, quite worn out with cares and infirmities. He was a very grave man and of a very fatherly presence, and unimpeachable in his morals. He was a firm Calvinist and a thorough Church of England man. He was somewhat indulgent to the more moderate Puritans, but the more zealous of them accused him sharply of being a persecutor, while the high-toned churchmen vehemently charged him with disloyalty to their cause. It is also said that as he had never exercised the pastoral care, but was made a shepherd of shepherds before he had been a shepherd of sheep, he was wanting in sympathy with the troubles and infirmities of ministers. He was severe in his proceedings against clerical delinquents, but he protested that he did this to shield them from the greater severity of the lay judges, who would visit them with heavier punishments, to the greater shame of themselves and their profession. He was in truth stern and melancholy. As compared with his brother Robert Abbott, the Bishop of Salisbury, it was said that gravity did frown in George and smile in Robert. The other brother of these bishops was Lord Mayor of London. The Archbishop was regarded as an excellent preacher and a great divine. Anthony Wood speaks of him as a learned man, having his learning all of the old stamp, that is to say, vast and ponderous. He published lectures on the work of Jonah and numerous treatises, mostly relating to the political and religious occurrences of the times. But to have borne an active part in the preparation of the most useful and important of all the translations of the Bible is an honor far beyond the chief ecclesiastical dignities and the highest literary fame. This person is Richard Eads. Dr. Eads was a native of Belfordshire, born at Sewell about the year 1555. At an early age, he was sent to Westminster School. He became a student of Christ Church in Oxford in 1571. He subsequently, tongue twister there, took his 2 degrees in arts and 2 more in divinity. In 1578, he became a preacher and arose to considerable eminence. In 1584, he was made prebendary of Yarminster in the Cathedral Church of Salisbury, and 2 years later became canon of Christ Church and chaplain to Queen Elizabeth. In 1596, he was dean of Worcester, which was the highest ecclesiastical preferment he attained. He was chaplain to James I, as he had been to the illustrious queen who preceded him, and was much admired at court as an accomplished pulpit orator. In his younger days, he was given, like some other fashionable clergymen, to writing poetry and plays. But in ripper years, he became, as the antiquarian of Oxford says, a pious and grave divine, an ornament to his profession, and grace to the pulpit. He published several discourses at different times. Dr. Eads died at Worcester, November 19, 1604, soon after his appointment to be one of the Bible translators, and before the work was well begun, so that another was appointed in his place. But let him not be deprived of his just commendation, as one who was counted worthy of being joined with that ablest band of scholars and divines, which was ever united in a single literary undertaking. Okay, Gills Thompson. This good man was a native of famous London town. In 1571, he entered University College, Oxford, and in 1580 was elected Fellow of All Souls College. A few years later, he was out in a shower of appointments. With his dish right side up, he was, at that lucky season, made divinity lecturer in Magdalen College, chaplain to Queen Elizabeth, as was his friend Dr. Richard Eads, prebendary of Reppington, canon residentiary of Hereford, and rector of Pembridge in Herefordshire. He was a most eminent preacher. He became doctor in divinity in 1602 and was in that year appointed Dean of Windsor. In virtue of this latter office, he acted as registrar of the most noble order of the Garter. Dr. Thomson took a great deal of pains in his part of the translation of the Bible, which he did not long survive. He was consecrated Bishop of Gloucester, June 9, 1611, and a year after, June 14, 1612, he died at the age of 59, to the great grief of all who knew the piety and learning of the man. Man is like the flower whose full bloom is a signal for decay to begin. It is singular that Bishop Thomson never visited Gloucester after his election to that see. Okay, Sir Henry Savile Knight. Some have doubted whether the Mr. Savile on the list of translators was the renowned scholar afterward known as Sir Henry Savile, but the matter is put beyond doubt by Anthony Wood and others. Savile was born at Bradley in Yorkshire, November 30th, 1549, of ancient and worshipful extraction. He graduated at Brazen Nose College, Oxford, but afterwards became a Fellow of Merton College. In 1570, he read his ordinaries on the Almagest of Polygamy, a collection of the geometrical and astronomical observations and problems of the ancients. By this exercise, he very early became famous for his Greek and mathematical learning. In this latter science, he for some time read voluminary lectures. In his 29th year, he traveled in France and elsewhere to perfect himself in literature and returned highly accomplished in learning, languages, and knowledge of the world and men. He then became tutor in Greek and mathematics to Queen Elizabeth, whose father, Henry VIII, is said by Southey to have set the example of giving to daughters a learned education. It is to her highest honor that when she had been more than 20 years upon the throne, she still kept up her habits of study, as appears by this appointment of Mr. Savile. In 1686, he was made warden of Merton College, which office he filled with great credit for 36 years, and also to the great prosperity of the institution. 10 years later, he added to this office that of provost of Eton College, which school rapidly increased in reputation under him. Thus, as Fuller says, the skillful gardener had at the same time a nursery of young plants and an orchard of grown trees, both flourishing under his careful inspection. He was no admirer of geniuses, but preferred diligence to wit. Give me, he used to say, the plodding student. If I would look for wits, I would go to Newgate. There be the wits. As might be expected, he was somewhat unpopular with his scholars on account of the severity with which he urged them to diligence. Soon after his nomination as one of the translators, having declined all offers of other promotion, whether civil or ecclesiastical, he was knighted by the king. About the same time, he buried his only son, Henry, at the age of 8 years. In consequence of this bereavement, he devoted most of his wealth to the promotion of learning. He translated the histories of Cornelius Tacitus and published the same with notes. He also published from the manuscripts the writings of Bradwarden against Pelagius, the writers of English history subsequent to Bede, prelections on the elements of allude and other learned works in English and Latin. He is chiefly known, however, as being the first to edit the complete works of John Chrysostom, the most famous of the Greek fathers. He spent large sums in procuring from all parts of Europe manuscripts and copies of manuscripts. He not only made learned and critical notes on his favorite author, but procured those of Andrew Downes and John Boyce, two of his fellow laborers on the translation of the Bible. His edition of 1,000 copies was published in 1613 and makes 8 immense folios. All his expenses in this labor of love amounted above 8,000 pounds, of which the paper alone cost a fourth part. It was 50 years before all the copies were sold. The Benedictines in Paris, however, thought their emissaries in England succeeded in serendipitously procuring the labors of the learned knight, sheet by sheet, as they came from the press. These they reprinted as they were received, adding a Latin translation and some other considerable matter, and forming 13 mighty folios. By this transaction, the friars may have gained the most glory, but surely are not entitled to much honor. Sir Henry Saville also founded 2 professorships at Oxford with liberal endowments, one of geometry and the other of astronomy. It is related of him that he once chanced to fall in with a Master Briggs of the rival University of Cambridge. In a learned encounter, Briggs succeeded in demonstrated some point in opposition to the previous opinion of Sir Henry. This pleased the worthy knight so well that he appointed Mr. Briggs to one of his professorships. He made other valuable benefactions to Oxford in land, money, and books. Many of his books are still in the Bodleian Library there. Sir Henry Saville died at Eton College, where he was buried February 19, 1621, in his 72nd year. He was styled that magazine of learning whose memory shall be honorable among the learned of the righteous forever. He left an only daughter, Elizabeth, who was married to Sir John Sedley, a wealthy baronet of Kent. Sir Henry's wife was Margaret, daughter of George de Cruz of Cheshunt, Esquire. It is said that Sir Henry was a singularly handsome man, and that no lady could boast a finer complexion. He was so much of a bookworm and so seditiously at his study that his lady, who was not very deep in such matters, thought herself neglected. She once perpetently said to him, "Sir Henry, I would that I were a book, and then you would a little more respect me." A person standing by was so ungallant as to reply, "Madame, you ought to be an almanac, that he might change at the year's end." At this retort, the lady was not a little offended. A little before the publication of Chrysostom, when Sir Henry lay sick, Lady Saville said that if Sir Henry died, she would burn Chrysostom for killing her husband. To this, Mr. Boyce, who rendered Sir Henry much assistance in that laborious undertaking, meekly replied that so to do were great piety. To him the lady said, "Why, who was Chrysostom?" "One of the sweetest preachers since the apostles' times," answered the enthusiastic Boyce. Whereupon the lady was much appeased and said she would not burn him for all the world. From these precious samples it may be inferred that your fine lady is much the same in all ages of the world, no matter whom she may marry. It is enough for our purpose that Sir Henry Saville was one of the most profound, exact, and critical scholars of his age, and meet and ripe to take a prominent part in the preparation of our incomparable version. And then the asterisk here says, make the usual allowance for the difference in the value of money then and now. He expended to the value of more than $300,000. Okay, John Purin. Dr. Purin was of St. John's College, Oxford, where he was elected fellow in 1575. He was the king's professor of Greek in the university and afterwards canon of Christ Church. He was created Doctor of Divinity in 1596. When placed in the commission to translate the Bible, he was vicar of Watling in Sussex. His death took place May 9th, 1615. These scantly items may serve to show that he was fit to take part with his learned and revered brethren in preparing our English Bible for the press. Okay, Ralph Raven. This was the vicar of Easton Magna, who was made Doctor of Divinity in 1595. He died in 1616. It is thought that he did not act for some reason under the king's commission, and that doctors Aglionby and Houghton were appointed in place of him, and of Eads, who died before the work was begun. Okay, John Harmer, a native of Newbury in Berkshire. He was educated in William D. Wykeham's School of Winchester and also at St. Mary's College, founded by the same munificent Wykeham at Oxford. Manners make the man, quoth William of Wykeham, is a motto frequently inscribed on the buildings of his school and college. Mr. Harmar became a fellow of his college in 1574. He was appointed the king's professor of Greek in 1585, being at the time in holy orders. He was headmaster of Winchester School for 9 years and warden of his college for 17 years. He became Doctor of Divinity in 1605. His death took place in 1613. He was a considerable benefactor to the libraries, both of the school and the College of Wykeham's foundation. For all his preferment, he was indebted to the potent patronage of the Earl of Leicester. He accompanied that nobleman to Paris, where he held several debates with the popish doctors of the Sorbonne. He stood high in the crowd of tall scholars, the literary giants of the time. He published several learned works, among them Latin translations of several of Chrysostom's writings, also an excellent translation of Beza's French sermons into English, by which he shows himself to have been a Calvinist, the master of an excellent English style, and an apt in the difficult art of translating. Wood says that he was a most noted Latinist, Grecian, and divine, and that he was always accounted a most solid theologist, admirable, well-read in the fathers and schoolmen, and in his younger years a subtle Aristotelian. Of him, too, it may be said, having had a principal hand in the translation, that he was worthy to rank with those who gave the scriptures in their existing English form to untold millions past, present, and to come. Okay, next translator is William Barlow. The Fifth Company of Translators was composed of 7 divines who held their meeting at Westminster. Their special portion of the work was the whole of the epistles of the New Testament. The president of this company was Dr. William Barlow at the time of his appointment. Let's see. Hang on. Let me check something here. Oh, okay. Hang on. I just didn't have a page over here just talking about, the Fifth Company of Translators. Okay, so we'll just go ahead and finish because there's 7 in this Fifth Company of Translators. we'll just do that because then it's easier. We'll read down through Mr. Sanderson. We'll read down to here, because then that's a good stopping place for me to remember, where I need to pick up in the next video, because then we're almost done. Maybe 2 or 3 more videos after this, and then we've read through this whole book. Okay, so the Fifth Company of Translators was composed of 7 dignitaries who held their meetings at Westminster. Their special portion of the work was the whole of the epistles of the New Testament. The president of this company was Dr. William Barlow at the time of his appointment, Dean of Chester. He belonged to an ancient and respectable family residing at Barlow in Lancashire. He was bred a student of Trinity Hall in the University of Cambridge. He graduated in 1584, became Master of Arts in 1587, and was admitted to a fellowship in Trinity Hall in 1590. 7 years later, Archbishop Whitgift made him Sinecure Rector of Orpington in Kent. He was one of the numerous ecclesiastics of that day who were courtiers by profession and studied with success the dark science of preferment. When Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, was beheaded for high treason in the year 1600, Dr. Barlow preached on the occasion at St. Paul's Cross in London. He was now a rising man. In 1601, the prebendship of Chiswick was conferred upon him, and he held it till he was made Bishop of Lincoln. In the year 1603, he became, at the time, Predinidary of Westminster and Dean of Chester. This latter prebendship he held in commendam to the day of his death, when soon after the ascension of James Stuart to the throne of England, the famous conference was held at Hampton Court. That monarch summoned, as we have said, 4 Puritan divines whom he arbitrarily constituted representatives of their brethren. To confront them, he summoned a large force of bishops and cathedral clergymen, of whom Dean Barlow was one, all led to the change by the doughty king himself. At the different meetings of the conference, the Puritans were required to state what changes they partly desired in the doctrine, discipline, and worship of the Church of England. As soon as they ventured to specify anything, they were browbeaten and hectored in the most abusive manner by the monarch and his minions. In his time, when comparing his reign with the preceding, it was common to distinguish him by the title Queen James, and his illustrious predecessor as King Elizabeth. When his learned preceptor Buchanan was asked how he came to make such a pendant of his royal pupil, the old disciplinarian was cruel enough to reply that it was the best he could make of him. This prince, who fancied himself to be what his flatterers swore he was, an incomparable adept in the sciences of theology and kingcraft, as he termed it, was quiet in his element during the discussions at Hampton Court. He trampled with such fury on the claims of Puritanism that his prelates, lordly and cringing by turns, were in raptures and went down on their knees and blessed God for such a king as had not been seen since Christ's day. Surely they were thrown off their guard by the exultation when they set such an impressive example of praying without book. This matter is mentioned here the more fully because the principal account we have of this conference is given by the Dean of Chester. It is not strange that the Puritans make but a sorry figure in his report of the transactions. gagged by royal insolence and choked by priestly abuse, it could hardly have been otherwise. Indeed, they were only summoned that under pretense of considering their grievances, the king might have an opportunity to throw off his mask and to show himself in his true character as a determined enemy to further reformation in his church. Dr. Barlow's account is evidently drawn up in a very unfriendly disposition towards the Puritan complainants and laborers to make their statements of grievances appear as weak and witless as possible. Had the pencil been held by a Puritan hand, no doubt the sketch would have been altogether different. The tempter of the king and of his sycophantic court clergy may be inferred from the mirth which Dr. Barlow says was excited by a definition of a Puritan quoted from one Butler, a Cambridge man. A Puritan is a Protestant frayed out of his wits. The plan of the king and his mitred counselors was the substitution of an English popery in the place of Romanish popery. Their notions were well expressed some years afterward in a sermon at St. Mary's, Cambridge. As at the Olympic Games, he was counted the conqueror who could drive his chariot, wheels nearest the mark, yet not so as to hinder his running, or to stick thereon. So he who in his sermons can preach near popery and yet not quite popery, there is your man. As we have already related, almost the only request vouchsafed to the Puritans at this conference was one which was well worth all the rest. The king granted Dr. Reynolds' motion for a new translation of the Bible to be prepared by the ablest divines in his realm. Dr. Barlow was actively employed in the preliminary arrangements. He was also appointed to take part in the work itself, in which, being a thoroughbred scholar, he did excellent service. In the course of the work in 1605, being at the time rector of one of the London parishes, in the course of the work in 1605, being at the time rector of one of the London parishes, St. Dunstan's in the east, Dr. Barlow was made Bishop of Rochester. He was promoted to the wealthiest see of Lincoln in 1608, where he presided with all dignity till his death. He died at a time when he had some hopes of getting the bishopric of London. His decease took place at his episcopal palace at Buckden, where he was buried in 1613. He published several books and pamphlets, which prove him not out of place when put among the learned men of that erudite generation of divines. Okay, the next one is John Spencer. Okay, John Spencer. This very learned man was a native of the country of Suffolk. He became a student of Corpus Christi College, Oxford, where he graduated in 1577. He was elected Greek lecturer for that college, being but 19 years of age. His election was strenuously but vainly opposed by Dr. Reynolds, partly on account of his youth and on the ground of some irregularity in his appointment. Perhaps this opposition was also to be ascribed to the fact that young Spencer early attached himself to that party in his college which dreaded Puritanism quite as much as popery. In 1579, he was chosen fellow of the same college. He was the fellow student, and like Sarvia and Saville and Reynolds, the intimate friend of Richard Hooker, the author of that famous work, The Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity, this work, in the preparation of which Spencer was constantly consulted, as was even said to have had a special hand as in part its author, and which he edited after Hooker's death. This work is to this day the great gun on the ramparts of the Episcopal sect. His argument, however, is very easily disposed of. It is thus ascribed by James Bennet: the architecture of the fabric resembles Dragon's Temple, for it rests mainly upon two grand pillars, which, so long as they continue sound, will support all its weight. The first is that the Church of Christ, like all other societies, has power to make laws for its well-being. And the second, that where the sacred scriptures are silent, human authority may interpose. But if some Samson can be found to shake these pillars from their base, the whole edifice, with the lords of the Philistines in their seats, and the multitude with which it is crowded, will be involved in one common ruin. Grant Mr. Hooker these two principles, and his arguments cannot be refuted. But if the Puritan can show that the Church of Christ is different from all civil societies, because Christ has framed a constitution for it, and that where the scriptures are silent and neither enjoin nor forbid, no human association has a right to interpose its authority, but should leave the matter indifferent in such a case, Hooker's system would not be more stable than that of the Eastern philosopher who rested the earth on the back of an elephant, who stood upon a huge tortoise which stood upon nothing. After the death of Hooker in 1600, his papers were committed to Dr. Spencer, the associate and assistant of his studies, to superintend their publication. He attended carefully to this literary executorship till the translation of the Bible began to engross his attention, when he committed to other duties, though still retaining a supervisory care, to a young and enthusiastic admirer of Hooker. The publication was not completed at the time of Dr. Spencer's death, and the papers of Hooker passed into other hands. When he became Master of Arts in 1580, John Spencer entered into orders and became a popular preacher. He was eventually one of King James' chaplains, his wife a pupil of Hooker's, as well as her brothers, George and William Cranmer, who became diplomatic characters and warm patrons of their celebrated teacher. Mrs. Spencer was a great niece of Thomas Cranmer, that Archbishop of Canterbury, whom Queen Mary burnt at the stake for his Protestant, in other words. In 1589, Dr. Spencer was made vicar of Alveley in Essex, which he resigned in 1592. For the vicarage of Broxbourne in 1599, he was vicar of St. Sepulchre's beyond Newgate, London. President of Corpus Christi College. On the death of Dr. Reynolds in 1607, Dr. Spencer was appointed to a prebendal stall in St. Paul's, London in 1612. His death took place on the 3rd day of April 1614, when he was 55 years of age. Of his eminent scholarship there can be no question. He was a valuable helper in the great work of preparing our common English version. We have but one publication from his pen, a sermon preached at St. Paul's Cross and printed after his decease, of which Keble, who is professor of poetry at Oxford, says that it is full of eloquence and striking thoughts. Okay, Roger Fenton. This clergyman was native of Lancashire. Lancashire. He was fellow of Pembroke Hall in Cambridge University. For many years he was the painful, pious, learned, and beloved minister of St. Stephen's, Walbrook, London, to which he was admitted in 1601. He was also presented by the Queen to the rectory of St. Benet's, Sheerhog, which he resigned in 1606, for the vicarage of Chigwell in Essex. He was also collated in place of Bishop Andrews to the prebendship of Pancras in St. Paul's Cathedral, where he was penitentiary of St. Paul's. His prebendship of Pancras also made him, so New Court says, rector of that church. He died January 16, 1616, aged 50 years. He was buried under the communion table of St. Stephen's, where there is a monument erected to his memory by his parishioners with an inscription expressing their affection towards him as a pastor eminent for his piety and learning. His principal publication is described as a solo treatise against usury. His most intimate friend was Dr. Nicholas Fenton, another London minister. The following singular incident is related of them by good old Thomas Fullerton. Once my own father gave Dr. Fenton a visit, who excused himself for entertaining him any longer. Mr. Fullerton, said he, hear how the passing bell tolls at this very instant. For my dear friend Dr. Felton, now a dying, I must to my study, it be mutually agreed upon betwixt us in our health, that the survivor of us should preach the other's funeral sermon. But see a strange change. God, to whom belong the issues of death, with the patriarch Jacob blessing his grandchildren, wittingly guided his hands across, reaching out death to the living and life to the dying, so that Dr. Felton recovered and not only performed that last office to his friend Dr. Fenton, but survived to more than 10 years and died Bishop of Ely. By that funeral sermon, it appears that Dr. Fenton was free of the Grocers' Company, a wealthy guild to whom belonged the patronage of St. Stephen's Church. He was also preacher of Gray's Inn, a society or college of lawyers. Bishop Felton says of him, none was fitter to dive into the depths of school divinity. He was taken early from the university and had many troubles afterward, yet he grew and brought forth fruit. Never a more learned hath Pembroke Hall brought forth, but with one exception. This nameless exception was doubtless the great Bishop Lancelot Andrews. Dr. Fenton suffered severely in regard to health in consequence of his sedentary habits. In the time of his sickness, says his friend, I told him that his weakness and disease were trials only of his faith and patience. Oh, no, he answered, they are not trials, but corrections. Okay, Ralph Hutchings, Hutchinson. Dr. Hutchinson, at the time of his appointment, was president of St. John's College, having entered that office in 1590. This, which marks him as a learned man, is all we can tell of him. William Dakins. He was educated at Westminster School and admitted to Trinity College, Cambridge, May 8, 1587. He was chosen fellow in 1593. He became bachelor in divinity in 1601. The next year, he was appointed Greek lecturer. In 1604, he was appointed professor of divinity at Gresham College, London. He was elected on the recommendations of the vice-chancellor and heads of college in Cambridge, and also of several of the nobility of the king himself. The king, in his letter to the mayor and aldermen of London, calls him an ancient divine, not in allusion to his age, but his character. This appointment was given him as a remuneration for his undertaking to do his part in the Bible translation. He was considered peculiarly fit to be employed in this work on account of his skill in the original languages. In 1606, he was chosen dean of Trinity College, but died a few months after, on the 2nd day of October, being less than 40 years of age. Though taken away in the midst of his days and of the work on account of which we are interested in him, he evidently stood in high repute as to his qualifications for a duty of such interest and importance. Okay, Michael Rabbit, all we can tell of him is that he was a bachelor in divinity and rector of the Church of St. Vidas, Foster Lane, London. And then I believe the last one is Mr. Sanderson. The bearer name is all that is left to us with any certainty. Wood mentions a Thomas Sanderson, D.D. of Balliol College, Oxford, who was installed Archdeacon of Rochester in 1601, but does not say whether he was one of our translators. Okay, so I'll go ahead and read this page, and then we will go ahead and close out. The sixth and last company of King James Bible translators met at Cambridge. To this company was assigned all the apocryphal books which in those times were more read and accounted of than now, though by no means placed on a level with the canonical books of Scripture. Still, this part of the translators had as much to do as either of the others in the repeated revision of the version of the canonical books. The reasons assigned for not admitting the apocryphal books into the canon or list of inspired scriptures are briefly the following. Number one, none of them is in the Hebrew language, which was alone used by the inspired historians and poets of the Old Testament. Two, not one of the writers lay any claim to inspiration. Number three, these books were never acknowledged as sacred scriptures by the Jewish church and therefore was never sanctioned by our Lord. Number four, they were not allowed a place among the sacred books during the first 4 centuries of the Christian church. 5, they contain fabulous statement and statements that contradict not only the canonical scriptures, but themselves, as when in the 2 books of Maccabees, Antioch Epiphanes is made to die 3 different deaths as in many different places. 4, it inoculates doctrines at variance with the Bible, such as prayers for the dead and sinless perfection. Number 7, it teaches immoral practices such as lying, suicide, assassination, and magical incantation. For these and other reasons, the apocryphal books, which are all in Greek except one is extant only in Latin, are valuable only as ancient documents illustrative of the manners, language, opinions, and history of the East. So, all right, we will go ahead and in there, I'll probably start the next video with this. We'll, just probably read it again, and then we will read a little bit about those who translated, these apocryphal books from Greek into English. All right, guys, so with that, I will close out and bid everyone shalom.